I don't have a presentation, but and I've written a speech, but then I've also then changed it. So, and I'm not as fluent a speaker as Guy, so my apologies for that. Thanks very much for having me back to speak. I think as a lot has happened with unconditional basic income since I spoke to London Futurists. I think it was back in 2015. We've gone quickly from a kind of interesting, slightly marginal idea to one which is discussed and argued over almost every day in the media. And you'll see even today there's quite a big discussion going on both in Twitter and in the press about various things that have been written about it. Just to say a little bit about myself, although I'd heard about basic income several years before, I started actively supporting the idea as a result of my experience as a claimant and then later as a welfare rights advisor, which is what I do now. I have to say that I was a claimant before the current kind of hostile environment for people who have to claim welfare, and that makes a big difference. However, it's still always rubbed that despite raising a child, improving my housing estate, and involvement with all sorts of community projects, from local archaeology and history to saving our local health center, people still kept asking me when was I going to get a job, as though only that would confirm my right to exist. Yet, when I was offered money for specific pieces of work, often I had to turn it down for fear of losing the small, though secure income I had. I was going to do a little bit about the current system. I think Guy's probably said enough about it. It's just to say that it's getting worse. It's been getting steadily worse since the current government, but it's actually even before that. The conditionality has just kind of ramped up in the last 5 years, and as Guy very movingly pointed out with one of his examples, people are actually dying from it. Now, perhaps this could be fixed by going back to the gentler regime of minimum income support from 20 or 30 years ago, and many, including the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, have suggested this, reacting to basic income as just another policy proposal. What is interesting, however, is the question of whether they would have made these suggestions without the growing popularity and interest in basic income, which has developed over the past 5 years. Basic income's popularity, however, is not simply a matter of this government policy or that, but of the perspective it brings. Okay, first let's talk about basic income as a policy. Several think tanks, including the RSA and Compass, drawing from the Citizens Basic Income Trust research and proposals, have come up with their own costed schemes for the UK. These prove that a modest UBI of between £70 and £100 a week is feasible within our current tax system, with some adjustments like raising the higher rate income tax and getting rid of the tax allowance. All have kept means-tested housing benefits, disability benefits, and pensions in place, state pensions in place, something which many critics ignore or even use against it. Critics have said this is not enough to live on, or that some of the concrete proposals make some people worse off. As CBIT has itself admitted, some of the proposals do result in less money for some people, but usually by not more than £500 a year. That is well below the cuts introduced by universal credit, which have left many people thousands of pounds out of pocket, along with threatened homelessness and/or a reduction in their ability to work. Let's face it, it costs money to get a job, whether that's the internet connection and phone you need, or the travel expenses to get to interviews, or clothes that look appropriate. And that's to say nothing of the food you need to survive. Since universal credit is neither universal nor paid in credit, it has caused untold suffering amongst the widening pool of people who have to claim it. The charge of not enough also ignores the resourcefulness within communities, the gifting and trading of goods that goes on without money changing hands, the informal borrowing and lending of small amounts which gets people through the next payment, On my estate 20 years ago, there was a £10 note which passed through several hands each fortnight and became a kind of totem of our solidarity with each other. When poor people don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from or where they're going to live, they can be incredibly creative with what they have. Just to say a little bit, I think I should say about the pilots, which I hadn't really been planning to, but Guy talked a little bit about Finland, As he said, that pilot has not been stopped. It's going to run to the end of its proper lifetime, which is until December, and then we'll get results from it. It's the whole. I certainly feel that the government in Finland was kind of pushed into doing the pilot at all, not because they agreed with basic income, but because it was like the one line in their manifesto that anybody paid any attention to. So now they've actually tried to introduce further conditionality in the current Finnish welfare system, and that's actually prompted a lot of demonstrations and people, including unions, people saying, no, you can't do that, all right? So it'll be interesting to see in the next Finnish elections what actually happens with the policy. This is certainly not, I'm sure that it's not the end of basic income in Finland, for sure. There's also a pilot running in Ontario in Canada. It just started a few months ago. There have been quite a few people that have come forward. There was a conference recently called the North American Basic Income Guarantee Conference, where they had some of the participants talk about what a difference it made to their lives. And one of the key differences was that they didn't have to go and justify absolute, things that they need, like glasses or shoes or other things that the state would provide extra, but then you had to apply for it. So that's one good thing that we can see already from that. And that should run, I think, for 2 or 3 years. I'm not quite sure. Another thing to say about the Dutch pilots, which made the headlines a few years ago, is that actually, while different cities were considering about doing pilots, because what they'd done is they'd regionalized the welfare system there, and that's why cities could suddenly do pilots. In 2015, the central Dutch government actually made it illegal to give people money unconditionally. Okay, so that's probably the major thing which is really pushed back the pilots. All right, it's not because people don't want to do them, and in fact, some city councils are considering how they can kind of get around this, and so that they can actually pilot a proper basic income. The other big place where pilots are being discussed at the moment is in Scotland. They've actually, in Fife, just this week, they've approved money for a feasibility study into pilots. If you look that up, there's quite an interesting range of levels that they'll be paying and where they'll be doing it. They're going to try to do some saturation testing, which will be interesting. It should be said that most, like in Finland, again, it's not really, they're not really testing a basic income as we would define it, because it's only going to unemployed people and only a random selection of them, so we won't see any community benefits from that. In Canada, it's a bit better, but also then to reduce costs, when people do earn money, then they're taking 50% of that. Okay, so it's basically lowering the normal marginal tax rate, which is about 80% when you're on welfare, but it's still, again, it's not completely non-withdrawable. The other interesting pilot which is going on, which I suggest people look up, is one being run by Give Directly, which is in Kenya and Uganda, I believe. That's a really long-term one. They're already reporting that, again, people are able to use the resources around them better, and are making businesses, are sort of creating small businesses with that. So it'll be interesting to see what over time, what difference that makes. There's also the pilot that Guy mentioned, which is in India, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. So it is actually being taken seriously as a policy option, and I think that's also what has kind of brought on some of the attacks and some of the other alternatives. People who really, really don't like the idea of just giving people money have come up with all sorts of other things, right, to avoid that. Right, okay, just a little bit more about the current welfare system. I think critics also ignore the fact that small, short-term or paid jobs have to be turned down not to upset people's secure means-tested income. These days, even self-chosen volunteering, which uses or develops skills and can lead to employment, is often used as an excuse by the DWP to deny people benefits they need to live on. The DWP would rather people did workfare chosen by them, even when it wastes their skills. And anyone who has been on tax credits while in paid employment knows the pressure to either limit your hours or not ask for a pay rise in case this tips you into overpayment. There's a kind of cliff with tax credits, which once you fall off of it is, you then have to pay back about £2,000 to £3,000. When somebody says UBI is simply a subsidy for employers, I know they have no idea how the current tax credit system, without going into the horrors of universal credit, does just that by design. In all the recent worry about falling productivity, what I see is a crisis in reproductivity. Most people suffer from not having enough time to spend with their families or their communities because they have to work long hours at a job or several jobs to pay the bills. And this goes through all across society. Okay, this is not just a problem for poor people. This is a problem all the way up the income ladder almost. Then there are people who, for whatever reason, don't have access to jobs, usually lack the money to fully participate in society. And so we lose their talents and skills, we lose their insight, often because people don't feel that they can actually go out and, because usually going out, especially in a city like London, means spending money either on a drink or buying food or something. And that's one of the reasons why, say, the privatization of parks and things is actually a really, really devastating thing for all people, because it means we can't mix. Right, so then, as also has been said before, more and more jobs are insecure, provide fluctuating amounts of money. How anyone can produce in the economic sense when they can't look after themselves and the people around them? How can they produce when they don't know from one month to the next whether they'll be able to pay their rent or mortgage? Or when they're worried from day to day whether they should eat or turn the heating on? There are proposals for partial basic incomes, as in steps to basic income, targeted to reach certain sectors of society. There is a proposal to restore and increase the rate of a universal child benefit, for example. Or there are also proposals, and I've been really interested to see that even the farmers' union in this country talk about this, of turning CAP, or whatever succeeds CAP after Brexit, into an agricultural basic income. So that it's not just about how much land you own, it's also, the people that work on it. And it might also then support some agricultural work within cities. And then there's another idea out there, which is a basic income for research scientists, so they don't have to spend so much time pitching for grants. And I don't know what the backgrounds are of the people out there. I know a lot of young scientists who spend an awful lot of their time either trying to get grants, or then once they get them, actually maintaining them. There's lots of reporting you have to do. You end up spending quite a long time not doing the thing that you've actually been given the grant to do. I also work in a charity and I do fundraising for it. The projects that we have to do, we have to kind of mold to whatever the trust is going to fund, which is one problem. But then we also have to spend an awful lot of time not doing what we're actually paid to do, but doing monitoring on it, and that's been really terrible. Okay, so I think these would all be improvements to the current situation and what's happening to people in those sectors, but I'm skeptical about the idea that they would be politically or practically easier to implement than universal payments. Most recently, there's been a plethora of proposed policy alternatives to basic income, which ride on its popularity, using the term universal basic in front to suggest something else: services, infrastructure, one-off payments, and jobs. They fail to attract people away from a basic income, not because they may not be good policy ideas, and some of which would, I think, sit very well with the basic income, but because they misunderstand why basic income is so popular. Another thing which is not considered on the left is that the old service model, all right, because we've been in such a kind of entrenchment mode and a kind of defensive mode, we're not really thinking about, as we try to save schools, or we're trying to save hospitals and various things, we're not actually thinking about, well, what is our model of education? And I was very happy to see some of that dealt with earlier. And the same thing with health. We don't really think about, well, what does a really healthy society look like? and how can we get there, as opposed to we've got to save the NHS now, all right, and not looking at how the NHS is very, as somebody who's campaigned for NHS services, I can tell you the NHS is incredibly dysfunctional at the moment, and it's not just because of privatization. It's because of structures that have been in place for about 20 to 30 years. What has been interesting lately is to hear how radio and TV programs scheduled to talk about one or other of these alternative proposals actually usually end up talking about a truly universal basic income, because that's actually what people are interested in. They're not interested in some kind of little, technocratic fix. They're interested in something that's actually going to change their lives and society. What many UBI critics also ignore, or maybe what worries some, is the fact that basic income, which is a regular cash payment, this is what people were asked, a regular cash payment to each individual, which is enough to live on without means testing or work requirement, paid for by taxes, is more popular than the notion of the state supporting people who can't or don't do a job. All right? That means basic income is more popular than welfare. All right? In the recent European Social Survey, and I'm just talking about the UK figures here, over 50% of people supported basic income, while less than 43% supported the welfare model. All right? And I think this is partially what is driving all these other things, anything but basic income, let's have state services or whatever. But they don't really get the fact that actually, a basic income, it's seen as fair because everybody gets the same. And also people are really at this kind of breaking point that I was talking about before in terms of being able to look after themselves and other people. And then the other thing that I think critics don't really understand is how winning a basic income could be crucial to winning whatever their pet policy is, and whether that's a shorter working week, better access to housing, reversing cuts to disability benefits, better health, education, or care services. Of course, basic income will affect current welfare arrangements, and I certainly hope it does. But while I support experiments to see how best to introduce it, I have come to feel that its introduction in some form soon is essential, whatever the experiments, usually not universal, may show. There are certainly other important policies to consider, but without basic income, I really doubt they'll go far. Okay, so basic income as a perspective. I'm actually talking to the title you gave my talk on the paper, so there you go. Okay, so although I started to support basic income out of absolute disgust with the current welfare system, what I've come to feel now is that everyone has the right to a share of the economy, whether they do paid work or not. It is not only a doctrine of empathy and compassion, it is a practical recognition that we are all dependent on each other. It is a way of recognizing our fundamental equality as human beings. It recognizes that everyone makes a contribution, regardless of paid employment, whether that's the essential work of caring for children or elders, which is mostly done by women, comforting a friend or loved one through a loss, or providing an insight which can resolve a problem. Anyone and everyone can and does do these things for other people, no matter what their physical or mental abilities or disabilities might be. While these can't be measured in econometric terms, there can also be no doubt that the economy, to say nothing of human society, would fall apart with all the things people do for each other without thought of payment. Another interesting aspect of the UBI debate is how it triggers thought about so many other aspects of society. It raises questions not only about how we conceive of work, but how we conceive of property, of relationships, of health, education, banking, and even money itself. In my experience, a discussion of UBI often opens up a space for people to talk about these things in a way they felt they couldn't before. So if you try to introduce, say, the problems with the banking system, for example, my experience has always been that people's eyes completely glaze over, and you've lost them, and then you talk about, well, yeah, but that could provide a basic income, and they perk right up. Right? And then they somehow, through that, they kind of manage to get to the banking, which is kind of interesting. It's because of this, it's one reason that I think basic income advocates are often faced with the charge of proposing it as a panacea. And Frank Field has just done an article about that today that's out there. Of course, many other things need to happen if humanity is not to extinguish itself in the coming years. Stopping war is a biggie, ending and cleaning up pollution is another. But what the panacea charge ignores is the fact that so many of society's current problems have at their foundation, or at least as a contributor, the lack of secure individual access to cash. Solve that, and I think it's hard to argue that basic income would not help people resolve other problems. So I've come to argue for basic income not so much as a way to fix the welfare system, but as a dividend, as Guy was arguing earlier, that we should all have as a right. And as he argued, we not only benefit from current contributions to society, but from all the accumulated past contributions, some from famous people we can name, but mostly of the millions unnamed. Not just our own direct ancestors, but everyone's ancestors. That's why Robert Heinlein, in his first novel, For Us the Living, called it a heritage payment. We should all have a share of the economy we all helped to create. And just as a kind of anecdote to this, just to say, my dad was a research scientist for the US military, and when he or one of his colleagues invented something and got a patent, they were paid $250. Okay? So, what happened? All right, like one of the people, one of my dad's friends invented light-sensitive glasses. All right? That patent was basically given to Polaroid, and many companies have made millions off of it, all right? And very little of that, relative to the actual benefit to society, has actually come back. Another thing is, for example, my dad actually invented a new alloy to put on silicon chips, which made it possible to industrially produce them. All right, back in, I don't know, 1971 or something. And again, he got his $250. And I'm not saying that that particular alloy is used now. I'm sure it's moved on since then. But we are still reaping the benefits from that, and some companies are getting a bigger share of that than others. David Graeber has recently said that the introduction of basic income would be a profound moral shift in what we recognize as valuable. As Graeber has documented in his recent book, Bullshit Jobs, and I really highly recommend people read that, a lot of what people regularly get paid for is simply unnecessary, while a lot of what people do but don't get paid for is crucial to society carrying on. The real question posed by UBI is not about the future of jobs, but about the future of what we do as humans and how we relate to the earth and each other. Unconditional basic income is an idea people don't forget, whatever their initial reaction to it. Tweaks to the current welfare system to make it less punitive, or projects to expand access to state services, while welcome, simply do not catch people's imagination, like the idea of regular cash in one's own pocket and cash you can depend on. In a world where most people's value is measured by how much money people have access to, giving the same basic income to each individual, I think, is powerfully symbolic. What the Indian pilot study showed, which Guy talked about earlier, was that it actually started to change the way people behave towards each other. Daughters got as much food as sons, disabled people got more respect, and people actually just started to work across caste lines on projects. With all the talk of the various ways to empower the marginalized, basic income stands out as the single most important means to do this. Many people see it as fair, whatever their political ideas, and in practice it confirms everyone's humanity. And on that, I would say that the Duke of Buccleuch should get a basic income, even if he doesn't need it, because it would remind him that he's actually part of the rest of society that he inhabits. My great hope is that everyone will demand it, whether on its own or with other ideas to make our society function better, and avoid the cataclysms threatened by war and environmental degradation. Basic income is not just a technocratic policy proposal or a set of proposals, it's also a perspective which affirms that everyone in society has the right to live no matter what they do. That's not just the kind of society I want to live on. live in, I feel it's the only way we'll all, as humans, have any chance of a future. And that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A quick question, Barb.
Okay.
Time for one or two quick questions. You mentioned this survey in which it seemed that more people were favourable towards basic income than to welfare, which was, for me, a surprising result, because I would have guessed that if you asked people, should we also give money to the Duke of Buccleuch, which universal basic income would propose, many people would say, no, actually, I don't want that. So I'm guessing the answers to such a question will depend quite a lot on exactly how it's asked.
Sure.
So which organisation did this? Was this done by an organisation supporting basic income, or was it independent?
No, it was the European Social Survey, which is a survey. They do questions about welfare every 6 years, and the last one they did was in 2016. The results came out in December 2017, and they have no dog in this fight. That's for sure.
No axe to grind. Questions from the floor?
I like everybody getting it as a basic income, and if people argue against it, you can always say, well, it can be taxed off the top if they got too much.
Right.
The thing that worries me next is about immigration. What are the criteria? When are you in and when are you out? And that that's a big worry with what's going on at the moment, locking people up and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's going to have to be fought out, basically. I mean, who gets it? I mean, the Citizens Basic Income Trust, although they have the title citizens in their name, actually say that it should be given to every legal resident. So people who have the right to work and who have been given. I mean, that's also something which is highly contentious right now, especially with the hostile environment against immigrants, for sure. I mean, personally, I would say that anybody who's participating in society, who has decided to live here and is participating in society ought to get it. But of course, that's going to be a political fight, as will be the level of it, and as will be whether it replaces and what it replaces in the current welfare state. So that's that's something to be fought over for sure.
One thing that surprised me is that I heard that some trade unions were skeptical of basic income. But I don't really understand that, because one of the big problems with trade unions right now is they don't have any money for strike pay, and it seems like basic income is the ideal strike pay. Do you know why trade unions would be,
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with unions, and we have quite a few trade unionists who are involved with basic income and support it, or in Basic Income UK. There were. What was it? It wasn't last year, it was the year before last. There were 3 votes. The TUC, Unite, and the GMB all passed motions in favor of basic income, all right? But what that doesn't affect is the people who actually run the unions, all right? And the people who run the unions are very, very, they still have the ideology of full employment, and they have I think they've got a very old way of looking at what work is. Because there are some efforts now, and there's some with the cleaners recently, or some with the picture house player. There's been some really interesting fights going on with what we would call precarious workers now. But actually, the large unions really have very little experience of that, and it's like they keep trying to kind of claw back into this so-called idyllic mode where people are working 40-hour weeks, which is disappointing. But we are making headway, and there are people who do understand it, particularly people who work in state services. We've had quite a bit of support from people, say, who work in the NHS or work in teaching, because they really do understand the benefits both to themselves, but also their students or their patients. So,
firstly, I think that asking questions at conferences must come under the heading of useful unpaid work as well. But, what I'm concerned about is this question about affordability. And you mentioned, well, if we remove tax allowances and increase higher threshold a bit, higher rate tax a bit, I don't think that works. And there's a few reasons for this. First off, we know that if there's going to be automation, then there's likely to be fewer people paying income tax because they'll be less employed. It is not obvious to me that corporation tax receipts will rise even if the percentage does, because actually what gets taxed is the underlying profit. And I haven't heard, for example, Mr. McDonnell talk about maintaining or increasing overall profitability of Britain's corporations, which would be necessary. I'd rather have a larger percentage of a large number than a large percentage of a small number. And then there's a few other sources. So realistically, taxation is only, or tax receipts are only going to go up a certain percentage. Let's say a relatively small percentage. But there's lots of calls for government expenditure, whether it's the NHS, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's the military, whether it's local government. All these things say, well, go to the Treasury and say, I want some of that, I want some of that, I want some of that. How are we going to fund this?
Okay, well, as far as the affordability question is, I'm not a statistician, all right? The studies that have been done by Compass and RSA and Citizens Basic Income Trust, they have run the numbers. Their main base is income tax, all right? I disagree with that. I think that there should be actually more, better taxes on wealth, as have been mentioned before, or closing tax havens. There's a number of other sources of money which actually we don't really think about it, and it's one thing that I think the unions have really missed, in the last 40 years, is that taxation has more and more become a burden on working people as opposed to on things that generate wealth without somebody having to do something. All right, so whether that's rent on land, or whether that's rent from patents, as Guy was mentioning before. I believe that there is the money out there.
I think we're going to come back to the affordability question with some of the other speakers as well.
Okay.
So thanks very much to Barb for giving us this perspective and for filling in some of the gaps that other speakers hadn't addressed. Very useful. Thank you.
Thanks.